Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is the Ukraine War news update, first part thereof for the 8th of December 2023. Thank you very much to Michael who has sent me this old school Vancouver Canucks NHL top. So I am now hopefully awaiting my new passport for the United States of Canada. Hopefully, you know, in times of difficulty in the UK, I'll be able to take a second home out there. Maybe on Whistler, snowboarding. Although, what with my walking, my inability to I fell over in the middle of a video yesterday. I was doing a video, you might not have noticed, but the doorbell went. I went over to get the doorbell, paused it, and then because I've got multiple sclerosis and I can't walk very well, I just absolutely spammed it in my corridor back there, in the hallway back there, and I absolutely hammered my arm. I broke my arm last year, if you remember. Broke my elbow falling over because MS sucks. So actually, I take that back. I'm going to be useless in Canada. It's such a big country. I'll just be sitting on my ass in some study somewhere talking to you guys. Anyway, it's enough preamble waffle. Let's go on with where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to the video below. Thank you again, Michael. Legend. 990 personnel lost, so that's dipped below 1,000, but not by a lot. It is still a significant number of Russian personnel lost in a single day. 8 tanks, less than yesterday, but still losing 8 tanks in a day is fairly careless. 26 armoured personnel vehicles is a heavy toll to take, and I think it shows that the Russians are still pushing in a number of places on the front line to lose this kind of equipment. 12 pieces of artillery is not a huge number considering what we have seen on some days throughout this war, but it is still going to be a bit of a loss for the Russians there. 30 vehicles and fuel tanks and 3 pieces of special equipment. So 30 vehicles and fuel tanks is a heavy loss in the kind of logistics department. So that's the daily synopsis there from the general staff. Let's see if we can justify those figures in any way, and we'll go to Andrew Perpetua's counting of equipment that's been lost over the last day, as according to the socials, and you can see that there is probably a 2.5, almost 3 to 1 loss ratios, or a loss ratio of Russian to Ukrainian losses. Ukrainians really could do with a higher ratio than that, all things considered, but as you can see, as a lot of equipment that the Russians have lost. Let's go and look at the Ukrainian losses first. Okay, comm towers and comm equipment. Don't know whether that's high value or not. It's a bit sort of vague, but generally not great to lose any kind of ISR or EW equipment, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, electronic warfare, whatever that may be. Although it does say comms equipment. A couple of boats there. We know they've had a delivery of sort of 56 boats, new delivery, and they're looking at getting about 180 in total, but the rest of them I think are stuck on the border, waiting to be transported. M777 howitzer, a couple of older tanks, not really too much to complain about in the grand scheme of things. Some civilian SUVs taken out there. That's not to say that they are civilian SUVs. They're SUVs being used for the military. So it's not the Russians are targeting civilian vehicles, although they have done that, and they've done that particularly in the Kherson region. That's been caught on camera a number of times. Right. As for the Russians, they've lost quite a few pieces of surveillance equipment, a comm tower themselves, a couple of bits of surveillance equipment, a Murom M unit, the air defense, Tor 1 air defense system taken out as well, so that's going to be fairly high value. Some artillery, a few different pieces of artillery and some tanks, generally a couple of older tanks that, well, not the T-90s, but although there are 2 unknown tanks, so who knows. And then quite a large number of BMPs and BMDs, basically infantry fighting vehicles. And again, it's interesting that there are no BMP-1s there. I refer back to the analysis that speculated that actually they're running low on those older pieces of equipment, and so the stuff they're rebuilding out of storage is the newer IFVs like the BMP2s and BMP3s, and actually that's what you're starting to see reflected in the Russian losses on the battlefield. And then quite a substantial number of trucks taken out here, a whole bunch of Urals, FPV drones, all of this looking like it's coming from almost a single montage of FPV drone footage. As you can see the timestamps there, so 2 bits of footage by the looks of it. representing all of those losses. So that is a logistical hit for the Russians there. And then as we go on, just to give an update on the Russian Karakurt-class corvette, the Askol, you know, the one that was hit in the dry docks in Kerch. Well, that was on November the 4th, indeed. It appears that, as many people knew, really, it's being reported as it is beyond economic repair, so it cannot be repaired. It's too substantial the damage for that. You'd start again rather than try and rebuild that one. It would be structurally somewhat unsound, I would have thought. Just too difficult to fix that. So that is, as one would have thought, beyond repair. There was so Tim White here says, looks like occupiers in Berdyansk escaped injury in yesterday's car bombing. So a military Ural vehicle was blown up near the Eternal Flame. Astra says a 36-year-old sergeant was the only person in the vehicle, but he escaped unharmed despite the damage to the car. Now, there is, it appears to me at any rate, a real uptick in partisan activity and saboteurs working behind the Russian lines in places like Berdyansk, Melitopol, Mariupol. We are hearing of a number of car explosions. We're hearing of assassinations back in Russia, and also relay stations, relay boxes, and whatnot, and also railway. Entire lengths of railway being blown up, or at least trains on a railway in the tunnel to the east of Russia, and the alternative railway line to that tunnel also having a train blown up on it. So I think there's a concerted effort to really make the Russians think twice, to have something to think about behind their own lines, and we are seeing that with this consistent sabotage that's taking place. Now, I don't know whether this is sabotage, what's behind this, whether it's a strike, whether it's someone just carelessly smoking. But Russian media report that Elektrozavod factory is on fire in Moscow. It's Russia's largest manufacturer of various transformer and reactor equipment. So I can imagine you can connect that to the military project fairly. If not the military project, then transformers, I don't know, maybe for substations, the energy infrastructure domain. I'm fairly sure this could be connected to the war rather than just being a random fire. But yet another fire. Just they are so prevalent in Russia. Right, now we're going to move on to distant strikes. And Tim White here says, rocket damage. The previous two tweets, he was talking about rocket damage in places like Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and also where was it? Pavlohrad district as well. There are some rockets that are hit. So rocket damage in the previous two tweets were coming from 6 S-300 guided aerial bombs launched by Russia from just over the border in Belgorod. None of those were shot down. It's such a short distance. They have a ballistic trajectory. It's very difficult to shoot them down. However, 5 of 7 drones sent to attack Ukraine were taken out by air defense. So there's only 7 drones used yesterday by the Russians, 5 of them taken out. But there were a number of missiles sent, and as mentioned here, a number of S-300s, those surface-to-air missiles, used in the ground-to-ground mode because they are so difficult to shoot down, although they're not always particularly accurate. This morning, and by the way, actually, before we get onto those missiles, where was it? So the S-300s, let's talk S-300s first then. During the night, Russian occupiers carried out massive shelling of Ukraine. Explosions were reported in Kyiv, Kharkiv and Dnipro. Certainly Kharkiv will be the S-300s, and this is the result of one of the strikes, typically a residential building. So there you go. That's in Kharkiv. Kharkiv is one of those places that's just been routinely hit, and it over the course of the war, it has been indiscriminately attacked with things like cluster munitions as well, and a kind of a retribution for not surrendering to the Russian ground forces that were almost surrounding it. So Kharkiv has come under a lot of Russian attention, and often, well, almost always, it appears to be residential areas and civilians who suffer rather than particularly military targets. This morning, an additional 19 KH-101 and KH-555 missiles, so these are cruise missiles, were launched towards Ukraine, of which 14 were shot down. So 14 out of 19 is fairly decent, but still obviously 5 cruise missiles getting to their targets. Or what were those targets? And with those cruise missiles, they're much more likely to hit their targets. I would imagine 5 military targets have been hit in Ukraine. Local military administrations will report on the consequences of the missile strikes, as Nell reports. So good, but still worrying. And this is nothing like the sort of wave we might expect given the stockpiling, the supposed stockpiling of all of these missiles and drones that apparently the Russians have. So all missiles flying in the direction of Kyiv were destroyed by air defense forces and means on the approach to the capital, says the Kyiv City Military Administration. And I said this yesterday that, you look at where the Ukrainians send most of their drones, and they hardly send them at Kyiv anymore because the air defenses are just too good around there. My personal opinion, if I was the Russians, is I wouldn't even bother with Kyiv anymore and just really try and hammer other places, exploit those weaknesses. But if they're still going to send them against Kyiv, then yeah, so be it. This afternoon, Russians struck at one of the thermal power plants in the frontline zone. 2 power units stopped working, the Ministry of Energy of Ukraine said. So, quote, due to this shutdown of thermal units, as well as a drop in ambient temperature, temporary shortage of electricity in the power system is being recorded. These are, I presume this is one in Donetsk region, possibly it keeps getting targeted. It's been hit, I think, 7 times over recent weeks. And twice within this last week. So that is a challenge for the Ukrainians. And here's a challenge for the Russians. So a video of a fire on a gas pipeline in the temporarily occupied Kerch has appeared, according to local channels. It's reported that 18,000 people were left without heating. I don't know what the reason would be for this, whether it is sabotage, whether it's been struck by a drone, who knows? I mean, it doesn't look like a massive explosion or fire. However, that will be causing the Russians something to think about. And here is, I was talking about a strike on Donetsk yesterday, loads of smoke across Donetsk, and saying some people called it an attack on an ammunition depot, but it's more likely oil because of all that dark smoke. Well, anyway, Russian tanks, fuel tanks and gas tanks supplying the front lines were shelled and destroyed in Budanovsky district of Donetsk. And here we have, I don't think it's the original miserable HIMARS clipboard man, but it is someone else with a clipboard going around looking at the scale of the destruction to all of these fuel tanks in Donetsk city. That is going to be something that the Russians will rue losing. That's an awful lot of supplies, not just in terms of the fuel itself, but the means to transport that fuel. So we've got trucks and trains and their fuel tanks as well getting taken out. So that might then have something to do with this 30 vehicles and fuel tanks as a fairly high number compared to other numbers on this list. It might have something to do with that strike. Right, now on to other bits and pieces. We have here Max-23 saying activity of the Russian aviation decreased after destruction of the enemy Su-24M, according to the naval spokesman Pletenchuk. I did report that yesterday. So that was the Su-24M in the northwestern area of the Black Sea that was firing on Odessa or the ports to the south of Odessa on the Danube. And that was taken out of the sky, both crew members perishing. There's been talk about that being as a result of a Patriot. There's been talk about it being any number of different air defense systems being able to be used against that or being used against that. Don't know what it was that took it out of the sky, but it has resulted in a drop in aviation activity in the area by the Russians, as you would imagine. So that is good for the Ukrainians. It has the desired effect. I mean, if it was something like the Patriot, you would like it in the way that they did when they took all those things down in, was it Bryansk or Belgorod, when they took 5 airframes down in short succession. I mean, that's what you're really dreaming of if you're the Ukrainian air defense teams there in charge of a Patriot battery rather than a single aircraft, and then the Russians react. But I don't know whether it was a Patriot, of course. And then we have a Belarusian has been detained for blowing up the trains with oil products in the tunnel, in his Severomysky tunnel. That's the one I was talking about over to the east that I reported on when it happened. The FSB says a man acted in the interest of the Ukrainian security services, specified that he installed magnetic mines on the trains. Whether that, I mean, you don't really see him. All we know is that there's a guy being walked to a door, and he's a Belarusian. Whether they have genuinely arrested anyone, I don't know. But nonetheless, they have claimed they've got one of the guys responsible for that. Ukrainian Railways transports a record amount of cargo since the start of the full-scale war. This will be largely in response to the blockades on the roads with the Polish and Slovakian truckers. So throughout November, Ukrainiznia Ukrainian Railways transported 14 million tons of cargo, a 33.8% increase compared to the same period last year, the Infrastructure Ministry reported on December 7th. I mean, that's a massive increase. So up your rail cargo by a third is pretty significant. So that is, I guess, really good news for the Ukrainian economy at the moment. And indeed, we have seen, I don't have it on there, I think it's in the geopolitical section, but actually they're starting to transport trucks like lorries. Instead of letting them get blocked on the border on the road, they're actually putting them on trains and nipping them into Ukraine on trains. So it's more expensive and it is less efficient. Of course it is, but it is a way around that issue, at least for the time being. And lastly, yet another plane in trouble in Russia. So another day, another emergency landing for one of Russia's dwindling passenger fleet. A plane operated by S7 flying from Novosibirsk to Moscow had to return after another fire on takeoff. So that is just this continued issue that the civil aviation authorities are having and passenger fleets are having in Russia. One must assume on the back of sanctions for parts and the lack of ability to do any decent maintenance on these aircraft has meant that it's a bit of a lottery to fly internally in Russia at the moment. It's not something I would be signing up to do in a hurry. Right, that's all for today's first news piece. Relatively short one for the first one. Next one won't be, as so much geopolitical stuff to talk about. Anyway, on to the next one. Take care, speak soon, toodle pips.